So often on this show, we talk to people who emphasize the importance of labor activism for all the reasons we understand and know, but also who highlight how difficult it is given
Yeah.
how diminished our labor participation is in the country. Do you have any kind of optimism or is there any potential edge here or opportunity here for people in lieu of other opportunities to try to strategically continue to do things like this GameStop fiasco and expose at the very least the extent to which the invisible hand is a fiction, that all of these economic premises like ability to pay equals willingness to pay are in fact fictions, that evaluations in large part are fictions? Is there no benefit to doing that kind of thing? And do you think it's possible for people to continue to create these kinds of moments?
So I think the first thing I want to say about that is that this whole saga is, I think, indicative of the forms of resistance that you get at a point of very deep and profound contradictions within the capitalist system, but in which the kind of countervailing forces that might exist, that might be able to kind of resist that might have the incentive and the ability to resist that and transform the system, just aren't organized and aren't coordinated enough. And that is the real problem here. And that is actually why I think, that we can have some sympathy for these guys,
Mm-hmm.
because you're looking, you like, as a kind of individual, like, young person, um like, trying to make it through the pandemic and get out the other side and think about, where you're going to be in 10 years, how you're ever going to be able to buy a house, how you're going to raise a family, how you're going to pay your rent at the end of the month, let alone all that. It's very difficult to see how you could change anything. And it's very easy to become hopeless and to become completely disillusioned.
Mm.
And this is kind of part of this whole, narrative that there was a point in time where, and perhaps we're still living in it, where it's easier for most people to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which is
Mm.
I think it was a Jameson quote originally, and Mark Fisher termed this idea, this ideology, capitalist realism.
Mm.
That it is kind of impossible to imagine that we could ever move beyond this system, which is so wide and vast and complex and deep. This system that structures not only the way that we, work and the way that we spend, but it structures our very sense of who we are, structures our
Mm.
relationships with each other, it structures our politics, our entire society. Imagining a world beyond that, when you are in it, when you are, constructed and constantly being reproduced and reconstructed by it, is very, very difficult. Now, Marx's answer to this was, of course, that capitalism creates a class of people with both the incentive and the capacity to, like use those moments of crisis to kind of break through the dominance of these social relations and build something new in their place. And that was supposed to be the kind of, the proletariat, the working classes, and a specific kind of working class, generally like, organized urban workers, who are together on a shop floor, who are, both treated like appallingly, who are overworked, underpaid, but also exist in this space where they can organize, where they can talk, and have to be educated to a certain level to be able to perform the tasks they have to perform. That then allows them to kind of generate some understanding of the system. Now, the problem, ever since pretty much Marx wrote that, has been the extent to which that agent, that kind of revolutionary agent, can generate a kind of form of class consciousness, so that can become a kind of class for itself, and can actually genuinely pose a threat to the system. And recently that has become a much deeper problem, which is the question of, does that agent even exist anymore? And on the
Mm.
surface, again, it comes back to this stuff that we've been discussing in the program so far. If you look at developed Western societies, it's easy for people to say, as many do, oh, there's no such thing as the working class anymore. Everyone's middle class. Actually, this was I've been going back over Gramsci recently because I'm using him for my book, and I pulled up this quote earlier, which I think really brings this out, which is, the bourgeois class poses itself as an organism in continued movement, capable of absorbing the entire society, assimilating it to its own cultural and economic level. This idea
Mm.
that everyone can become middle class. And a
Mm.
lot of people have been taken in by that. of course, this is all about the reorganization of global capitalism, such that, whilst we have a growing middle class in the global north, it's generally based on the outsourcing of labor to many parts of the global south, and the kind of reorganization of the production process, such that people managing production, people kind of speculating over what's going on in production, can exist in these countries with strong labor rights, and the people who are actually producing the stuff can exist with countries without strong labor rights. And that, again, creates a much deeper problem about, right, so the people who are potentially the kind of revolutionary agent are dispersed all around the world, generally in very authoritarian states, and are often kind of not really, like, don't conceive of themselves as this kind of coherent agent, working class, that's going to overthrow the system. And the people who are living in states where, you know, there is perhaps the greater potential, the capacity to organize, because there's high levels of education, there's more kind of developed public services, etc., are generally not in those conditions that that Marx would talk about. So that is the context in which we find ourselves. And obviously, it's an incredibly challenging context. And it was supposed to be a challenging context because that's a big part of what neoliberalism was about. It was about disguising this divide between labor and capital, disempowering the working classes, kind of taking away the idea of the revolutionary agent, and therefore taking away the idea that there could ever be life beyond capitalism. And how we get out of that is like such a multi-layered question that, yes, comes down to how we organize, how the labor movement works, but it also is like much more expansive than that. It's like, what forms of protest and direct action can we use to recenter this contradiction? How should we orient ourselves towards the state? How should we orient ourselves towards the rest of this global movement? Where are the weaknesses of this model? What's going to happen with the next kind of crisis that it generates? So yeah, I mean, I've gone on way too long on that subject. But in terms of the like general question as to how we, like, you know, re-empower and revive the labor movement, that I think, especially for a lot of leftists who have for the past 5 years or whatever been focusing on the electoral realm, it should be our number one priority. And I think a lot of it comes down to political education. So a lot of the kind of bigger unions have become, you know, the only time I really get like a communication from my union is when they're offering me life insurance or like a cheap deal on something. Like, you know, there's no real kind of attempt to engage the rank and file to translate this relation between a worker and a boss into a wider social relation that can galvanize political action. Political education is a big one there. My friend Leo Panich, who sadly passed away last year, was really, really keen on that and really centered that in his discussions of this question. And yeah, I think that should be the start. You can ask me how we do that if you want, but I've already been speaking for way too long.
Well, I mean, that is the question, right? I mean, whenever we have these conversations, I'm very keen to drill down to that next level, because I do think that that's where you discover the difference between what amounts to kind of a platitude and what amounts to a real plan of action. And there are people who would, I think, very happily stay in platitude space because for reasons they may or may not be actually invested in change. But I think that listeners start to zone out. I mean, people start to disengage when they're just told for the zillionth time how difficult everything is. No one has a problem with it being difficult, but they do want to know that there are opportunities to take advantage of. So I do want to ask, you know, if not this, if not GameStop, you know, I could see an argument that says everybody thinks they're bourgeois. Why not allow them to mobilize their bourgeois identity and co-opt bourgeois systems and at least throw monkey wrenches into the machinery in lieu of, or while we are re-educating and re-engaging people in traditional labor organizations. But in lieu of those kinds of efforts, you know, what is the next step? And, you know, does the education process, how much does an economic education of the type that you're giving us in this program play a role?
I completely agree with that point about, you know, by virtue of the world system that we live in, the societies that we live in the societies in which we're trying to organize they're not dominated by any stretch of the imagination by middle class groups, but the middle class is a very substantial section of the population of one kind or another, however you want to define that, whether it's like professional managerial jobs or asset ownership or whatever. And, we have to find ways of being able to encourage that group to identify with their existence as workers, or at the very least not as the top 1%. Right. This is what the whole many and the few thing distinction is, right? Like the success of neoliberalism was always about encouraging that group, that middle group in the global north, to align with the people at the very top. So we have to figure out ways to highlight that antagonism between the many and the few, between the 1% and everyone else, whilst giving people a sense of their own power. And this is the point I made in the article. I think there are lots of different ways that you can do that. And it isn't just labor organizing. I mean, the first thing I would say to anyone who's listening to this is, if you're not a member of a union, join a union, right? Number one, join a union. If you want, maybe show up to your branch meetings or whatever it is in the US every now and again. Maybe talk to your colleagues about it. But I was actually watching, there's this funny show on Netflix at the moment, Superstore. I don't know if you've seen it. That's clearly modeled on Walmart. And it's like a really interesting, popular account of like the challenges of trying to form a union and actually organize. I think that was a really good pop reference to that. So yeah, join a union, number one. But there are all sorts of different forms of direct action, of protest, of organizing that people can do. And that are actually already happening. We can talk about this from a theoretical perspective, but good organizers know these things and what they need to be doing. So whether we're thinking about, for example, in the UK, Extinction Rebellion, which has had some good organizing tactics and some howlers as well, but they did a good one recently, which was shutting down the Murdoch-owned press, which had put all this stuff out about how climate change, wasn't real, or, wasn't as big as everyone said it was. Really good example of an interesting direct action that highlights this antagonism, highlights a bad guy, and encourages people to feel powerful, because look, we had this impact on the system. We stopped the presses for a day. That's big, and that's interesting. We have actually seen an increase over the course of the pandemic, which is a reversion of a very long trend of more people joining unions. Again, in the UK, we have the show Love Island, which is kind of like The Bachelor, but weirder. And one of the people who was on there had been a flight attendant and said, join a union. This is going to be really important. So stuff like that, where it becomes better represented in kind of popular culture. Lots of different forms of protest have increased in lots of different parts of the world in recent years. So, I mean, sometimes that's anti-Brexit protests, which, I wouldn't agree with, but at least they're giving these middle-class people an experience of getting out on the streets and resisting and organising, through to anti-austerity protests against student cuts. There are other identities as well that people may lock onto more than this labour capital one. So debtor organising, for example, joining a debtors union, joining a renters union. The renters unions have been so powerful over the course of the pandemic. Places like Acorn, and especially in the US, where you have these huge corporate landlords like Blackstone, which own vast swathes of these cities, and can really you can really kind of highlight that labour capital distinction there through that kind of organising. So I think there's loads of different stuff that's going on. And to be honest, I've said this many, many times now, I could be wrong and end up looking really stupid, but I think there is this undercurrent of discontent and of kind of a real desire to actually organize and get out on the streets, which when this ends, I think is going to explode a little bit, I hope.
This being the COVID lockdown?
Or this episode.
Yeah. This, whatever we're in right now.